Welcome to this evening's Yakety Yak. I'm Peter Shergold and I head up the Centre for Social Impact. I am delighted that this evening's Yakety Yak is hosted by the National Australia Bank because they are one of the major social investors in the Centre for Social Impact. I'm delighted also that this evening's guest is Arthur Sinodinos, because I feel fortunate indeed that in the 5 years that I headed up the department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, for most of that time I had Arthur heading up the Prime Minister's office. As you will undoubtedly discover this evening, Arthur is a fine economist, someone who is genuinely interested in the broad range of public policy issues, who worked as a public servant and therefore understood the capacity and the constraints on public service, and I suppose should also say has a rather wicked sense of humour. I can remember on one memorable occasion when Arthur, as he always did, was at the annual Christmas party for the Prime Minister giving his speech. He confided to the Prime Minister, thankfully I had the job by this stage, that I had come to Australia to build a socialist republic and ended up working for Prime Minister John Howard. And it went down well, and I got stuck into the red wine. This evening it's again the host interviewer is Peter Thompson. He's done a series of Yakety Yaks for us now, and for the final Yakety Yak for 2009 I'll ask Peter Thompson and Arthur Sinodinos to come and sit at the front and let the interview begin. Thanks.
Actually, it's great to have Arthur as guest here for Yakety Yak, because in the not too far past you've traversed the area from working for government very close to the centre of power, also now working in the private sector, and you've got a long interest in not-for-profits as well, so you sort of cross over the three areas, the first, second and third sectors really. I'm struck by a remark you made about the reform process, that you nod, not too sure what remark it was, obviously. What am I referring to? I'm referring to you saying that you take the reforms that you can get. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant by that was there used to be a view that you could sequence reform. I remember the OECD always used to argue, well, you start with, say, the labour market or the product market, then you work through the financial market or whatever. But what I found, particularly when I was working in Treasury, and this was something that I think I certainly was taught by Ted Evans, which was when an opportunity came along to build a coalition to get something done, don't hesitate. Because every time you did something that reformed the system in one area, it helped to open up new possibilities and opportunities. So therefore, in the early 80s, should the Hawke government have held off on financial deregulation in order to wait for something better to come along or a bigger reform, the view was no, let's take that while we can, because the circumstances were propitious to get that done. That actually helped to open up other possibilities. So one reform then creates a pressure for doing other things. And the whole purpose of reform wasn't because there was some funny little model sitting in Canberra saying this is what you should do because this is good to maximise this particular variable. It was because, particularly in the late 70s and early 80s, we were conscious in Australia that the model we had for so long about as a country was starting to run out of steam, and the world was changing around us. And the question was, how do you provide an impetus to get change? And given the way our politics works, because it's very much interest group driven, often you don't get change unless there's a sense of urgency. That tends to build a coalition for change. So I think one of the things that Hawke and Keating did was very skillful, was build a sense of urgency around getting some of these things done, and therefore to use something like financial deregulation as the initial big reform which helped to open up doing other things was very important.
There's an addendum to this, and you were saying in relation to the reform process that without political sponsorship there's nothing.
Absolutely.
You refer to the
you need
Keating sense of... Yes.
You need champions. I think Keating was a champion. I think Howard was a champion of reform. They weren't afraid to go out there and argue a case. I've argued recently on the emissions trading scheme that I think there was a period there where there was a bit of a gap where I think the Prime Minister could have done more to actually argue the case and put the case to the public. I think things fell into a vacuum for a while, and that tended to be filled by the focus on the opposition. Now, the opposition did a good job of putting the focus on themselves, but the point is, with a lot of these reforms, you've got to have someone out there who's prepared to say, yes, there will be problems, there will be difficulties, but this is why we're doing it and this is where we're going to end up. And by the way, we recognise what the problems are and this is how we're going to handle it. That's how the GST was handled, and that's how Keating in particular handled a number of reforms in the 80s. What struck me at that time when I was working in Treasury was Keating's capacity to go up to the press gallery and essentially, if you like, second a lot of the gallery to what he was doing. He wasn't saying they should suspend their critical faculties. What he was saying is, look, this is my argument. This is why I want to do it. He'd go up there with diagrams of the J-curve. You know, when we were talking about the balance of payments.
What about the J-curve?
To explain why, for a while, you know, when you have a depreciation, you won't get the improvement in the balance of payments you expect. He was prepared to argue it. Howard, in '98, put together, having experienced it from both sides, put together a package on the GST where he was prepared to admit, yes, we're imposing this tax here, we're taking that tax off, and these are the benefits you get. And I remember in the end, the strategy around that particular reform was very much at the individual level, look, we're going to try and make sure you're not worse off. We'll have income tax cuts, another way to compensate you. But at the end of the day, I remember at his policy launch in Parramatta in '98, asking people to call it for Australia. And it was funny because after the election we did some research around the sort of voting groups that supported the coalition. We'd lost a few seats and votes that time, and we had, you know, plenty of seats from the landslide in '96. But we actually found there was a group in the community that supported what the government did, not because they necessarily liked the GST, but because they were aware the GST was a bit unpopular. They thought, well, if the government's doing it, they must think it's something that's necessary to be done. And they actually gave the government then credit for doing it. And by the way, in '98, part of the reason we lost the seats that we did wasn't so much the GST, it was actually the One Nation vote. 1 million people who voted in One Nation split the non-Labor vote, and then when they preferenced, their preferences tended to split more evenly towards Labor in those days, and the result was we lost a number of seats. So I'm not sure the reform was necessarily what lost us a number of seats.
You've done a perfect job at staying below the radar for a long time. But you're about
Doesn't feel like
you're
that.
You're about to surface now. We're going to talk to you about where you came from, because I find it so interesting. I spend my life talking to people about their backgrounds, and it's so interesting to connect up how people develop according to how they were in the first place. Your parents came from the Ionian Islands in Greece, and you didn't speak English as a young child.
Until I went to school. No, my father was a merchant mariner. He was from an island in the Ionian Sea called Kefalonia, which is where Captain Corelli's Mandolin was filmed. And if you saw the film, that's actually based on a real incident where during the war, the island was occupied by the Germans and the Italians. And when the Italians surrendered, or changed sides, the Germans let them go, and then as they were leaving in their ships, bombed them in the harbour. And so you find a lot of Italian graves on the island, and these to this day you still find a lot of Italians who go back to the island to visit graves there.
The population is 45,000 or something, quite small.
Yeah, it's quite small, but my father was a merchant mariner. He ended up in the Pacific during World War II and then couldn't get back to Greece, so he ended up working on those ships that were plying the Pacific at that stage. He was in the merchant marine rather than the Navy, and he got bombed on various ships at various times. So when the war was over, he stayed in Australia. How he regularised his papers, I don't know. But he ended up in naturalised Australia. There were a few of them in those days. So he ended up in Sydney at that stage, and then ultimately in Newcastle, which in those days was a big steel city. Big port, it's still a big port, the big bulk ships, and so he ended up working on those big bulk ships that plied the coast. My mother was from the same island, she was from the same village. It was arranged marriage in the sense that the two families had known each other, and she decided to come out after the place is prone to earthquakes, the island, so she came up after a big earthquake in 1953, and they got married. And in Newcastle, in those days there wasn't a Greek Orthodox church there. They used to get the services done at the local Anglican church, which was always quite ecumenical, and still is. So I ended up being born in Newcastle. I was the first of 3 kids. I have a sister who's about a year younger than I am. She's back in Greece. She lives in Greece. And I've got a brother who lives in another Greek city known as Melbourne.
The most important Greek city. Now, so at home, Greek is the spoken language.
Yeah, when we were growing up, we only spoke Greek at home. So until I went to school, I only spoke Greek.
You speak quite good English, actually.
Well, I picked up a bit as I went along. So, and of course, at that age, when you're young, and this is something that's stayed with me, and it's my belief in the value of language, kids can pick things up so quickly. I didn't feel a great difference when I went to school. It was so absorptive. And I regarded myself as lucky having learned a second language, partly because a language like Greek, which has got a lot of the root words for English, Latin is the same, it's tremendous when you can go through the English language and see how much of it has come from Latin and Greek, but I can particularly appreciate the Greek bits. So when I see words like Philhellene, which means a love of Greece or Greeks, the etymology of so many scientific and philosophical words, in an unconscious way, it was a tremendous learning experience. And it taught me the value of people learning language. And if you can get kids to learn languages early, I think it expands their minds. And I think it helps to get them to understand other cultures. Even though I had some difficulties growing up, partly because being a Greek Australian caught between 2 cultures, I think in retrospect, it was a great learning experience.
When you think back, did your parents politicise you?
Hard to tell. My father was a member of the Seamen's Union of Australia, which was one of the forerunners of the MUA. You'll remember them. And he was a staunch unionist, although in a sense he had no choice. The SUA was a very strong union. Its secretary in those days was a guy called Elliot V. Elliot. I remember that quite well because my father used to bring the newsletters home. But he was quite happy with them because in those days they'd negotiated some pretty good rates. But in terms of his own politics, he wasn't, I suppose in a sense he was middle of the road. My mother was more to the right. And my mother's background was probably quite a big influence on me because she had been through the war in Greece and the Civil War. And the Civil War in Greece had been a very bitter experience. In Greek there's an expression, ekphilio, which is our description of a civil war. And it really goes to within the family, having a fight within the family. And literally that's how it was. Families were split down the middle. And she could, when she was alive, recount stories about, people coming in the middle of the night to knock on the door. And in many of these villages, say this was the left in those days, would be taking away the teachers, the professional people in the village and whatever. There was the whole controversy over the kidnapping of children who were kidnapped from very early ages and taken to live in Eastern Europe or Yugoslavia. And, some horrific stories. Now, look, there were massacres on both sides. But the fact is, that made her, I think, very much on the right and very much a believer in the freedom of individuals. And I think she was a big influence on me in that regard.
Was there a seminal political event for you? I think of people that are left-leaning say, it was the sacking of the Whitlam government. That politicised me and I joined up to the Labor Party. Was there something for you that actually turned you to being much more interested in politics?
No. But I was relatively, I think I was mildly right of centre growing up. Partly, I think, because my mother was a bigger influence on me than my father, in part because my father was away 6 months of the year, although he retired when I was about 13, so I saw more of him then. But she was a stronger influence. So I grew up with probably a more conservative bent. I'm a very conservative individual, privately, socially, in whatever way you want to describe it. I didn't really go through a long-haired, wild-eyed phase at university. I questioned things, but...
I've got the pictures.
Yeah, that's right. But I gradually, if anything, over time became more to the right, I suppose. But I sort of started mildly that way. I was concerned about a lot of things. I had a certain religious bent. Up until about the age of 15 and 16, I wasn't much interested in religion, but something seemed to happen in my mid-teens. I became more interested in religion. That was an influence on me. It wasn't something I sort of displayed on my sleeve or, wore on my sleeve, as it were. But that was quite important to me. Going to church was important. And in those days, the Greek church was a religious centre and it was a social centre for the community. And so a lot of my early life was really wrapped up in all of that.
When I mentioned Arthur's involvement in the third sector, he's been quite involved in the Canberra Greek Orthodox Church, and we'll come to talk about that in a minute, sort of your face-to-face involvement in the not-for-profit sector. But first-class honours degree from Newcastle University in economics.
It did. It was funny because my parents didn't want me to go away to Sydney because I'd been accepted into law in Sydney.
Dangerous ideas in Sydney.
Well, maybe. So I decided I'd do economics first and maybe do law later, but I started doing economics and I enjoyed it. Why did I enjoy it? It wasn't so much the maths. I wasn't so much interested in the quantitative aspect. I mean, for example, I'd always liked history a lot, and so economic history in particular I really enjoyed doing. Reading, writing and whatever, but as I got more into it, I thought, well, this helps to explain how the world works. I mean, I went through the phase of being aware of all the ideological arguments that were going on about the nature of neoclassical economics versus, the sort of stuff that was going on at Sydney Uni around political economy. I was aware of all of that. Naively accepting whatever I was taught. I was aware of the arguments and the counter-arguments. But I thought, leaving aside the ideological aspects, economics does help to explain how the world works. So if you're going to do anything going forward, you needed to have some economics, some economic understanding. And as I got into it more and more, I sort of forgot about the law and decided, well, what I'll do is try and apply these economic skills. And this may sound very mundane, but I remember picking up a paper that had been written by the then Department of Labour and National Service about indexation, wage indexation. I thought, well, this is interesting. This is quite practical stuff. So if I'm going to use economics to do things, I want to use it to do practical things, policy things. And at that stage, it wasn't because I had a burning desire to change the world, but I was interested in policy. From a young age, I loved anything to do with politics, current affairs. I loved to watch the stuff even when I was a young kid. Big interest in geography. Liked reading up on what was happening in other parts of the world, what was in other parts of the world. So in a sense it was a natural progression building on that to go to Canberra. There weren't that many jobs for economists in Newcastle, and Sydney at that stage, I think it was the Reserve Bank, but you've got to draw the line somewhere. I didn't want to go there. Canberra seemed to be where the action was in that sense, and that's how I ended up in Canberra.
You joined the Department of Finance, then you go to Treasury after a year or so and you do various jobs there around microeconomic reform and the like. Then you apply for a job as a member of John Howard's staff.
In 87, yeah.
Gerard Henderson, God bless him, is the Chief of Staff and knocks you back.
I'd applied, I think, in 85 after Howard became leader when they were advertising positions, and I allege, and Gerard disputes this, that I'd sent in an application, he knocked me back saying there weren't enough positions, and he's asked me to produce the letter, and I'm still trying to find the letter. So we had this exchange, we've all kissed and made up since, but anyway. But by 87, after the Joe for PM election, 87, a friend of mine, Tim Stewart, who worked in the office, Treasury guy, had decided to leave, and he said, look, would you be interested in coming up here to do the job? And I said, yeah, I would be interested. I was interested, and I'll come back to Howard in a minute, but I was also interested because it seemed to me, working up there, you're at the coalface of decisions being made, even if at that stage talking about opposition, trying to influence what people are going to do. It seemed to me a more direct way to have influence rather than just doing it in the public service, writing notes, seeing ministers from time to time and all the rest of it, but it seemed to me a more direct way to exert influence, so I was quite interested. So when Tim left, I got the call to come up for an interview, and I went up to see John Howard and a couple of his advisors, and it was the old Parliament House, and everything was, all the rooms seemed too small for the number of people in them. And there'd be the constant bells going, and there'd be people speaking in the chamber. I think when I was up there, John Stone was speaking in the chamber about the Australia card and fulminating and carrying on. And we were conducting a sort of an interview in the middle of this cacophony, but that gave you a feeling for what the place was like. It was utter chaos, and as I was to find out, even more so than I thought. But Howard didn't really ask me any. He took it for granted I knew about economics, which, that was good. It was more personal questions, and at the end he said, are you married? And at that stage I wasn't married, and I said no. He said, well, this job's not going to do anything for your prospects, which was his sort of gentle way of saying you're going to be working pretty hard. But why was I attracted to working for him? Partly, as I said, the experience of working directly, but also I'd seen him operate, and he seemed like a plucky figure, someone who was prepared to stand up for something and keep pursuing it and fighting and trying to get something done, and I found that quite admirable. Obviously, I had a broad sympathy with his positions. It's hard to do those jobs if you don't have that. But as an individual, he struck me as having pluck.
Well, he said about you that you were very much in sync with him.
Well, I think in broad terms,
later period.
Yeah. I think in broad terms there was we were in sync in that sense. And if you're going to have influence, there's no use going up there and just being contrarian the whole time. You've got to pick your moments, because if you're going to have effective influence, you've got to have credibility, and credibility comes from trying to play it straight. Some people think that to have influence, you've got to gild the lily. I think you've just got to, once you've built up the trust, hopefully, be able to tell people, frankly, where you think things are going. And it did take a while with Howard for him to trust people. Politicians are very used to being betrayed.
Yeah,
and he'd had a few experiences of how that happens in politics, and it can take a while to build up trust. But I think he sensed that while I was broadly sympathetic, I was prepared to say my piece. And in fact, I think partly the reason he had that in his head is because he knew the sort of training I would have had in Treasury. And it's not that Treasury is contrarian, but, there is a Treasury view. There's no doubt out there is a Treasury view. And it was a view that was implicit in many of the policies, or explicit in many of the policies Treasury pursued in the 80s. That whole reform agenda was very much a creation of people in Treasury. Stone was the creator of part of it, but there was another large slab of it, Ted Evans, David Morgan, you go through the list, Bernie Fraser. A lot of them were on the same page, the late Chris Higgins. And he knew that, I think John Howard knew that Treasury people do tend to be critical thinkers. They're not just going to accept something at face value, they'll want to toss the proposition around. And I think he valued that.
I should say, after John Howard lost the leadership of the Liberal Party, you went back to Treasury and were acting First Assistant Secretary, etc., etc. You were climbing the ladder.
Yeah.
So you go back to his office in '96. If he'd not become Prime Minister, do you see a future for yourself in Treasury? I mean, in following the sort of the tradition of the people you've just talked about, who were major players in reform?
I'm not sure. I think Treasury would have had me back. I remember when I left in '95, Ted Evans was very gracious about it, because he said, look, it's important that we being Treasury, have people who try and influence both sides. So he saw it as very much putting his person in the leader of the opposition's office rather than vice versa. And that was fair enough too. And he mentioned that to me years later as well, when I was working in the then PM's office. But I think ultimately I probably would have left Treasury and done something else, probably on the basis that, given I was looking to do something more directly at the coalface, I probably would have tried to find something else to do. I remember when I went back in '95, Howard had rung me up after he won the leadership again, and he was trying to. He likes having people around him that the trusts he's had around him before. I remember him saying, "Well, we're either bound for glory or oblivion," and that in a funny way is what swayed me in the end to go back, because I thought, well, that's a pretty good attitude, We'll just see what happens. And I thought, well, okay, I threw caution to the wind, being a very cautious character. And okay, I'll give it a go. And interesting 1995, big parallels with 2007, and we can come back to that if you like. Culminating, and I didn't believe the coalition would win the election until election night. I remember Kim Beazley once saying that governments seem so all-powerful and entrenched and, power of incumbency. You don't really believe they're gone till they're gone. And that was very much my experience. It wasn't until election night that I sort of knew, well, there's been a change of government. Here we go.
So in that period, you're Chief of Staff. You're there in that role for virtually 9 years, and as various people have commented, no one has had a relationship with the Prime Minister, anything like that long, in such a key position.
I guess I'm pretty unimaginative.
Well, as Peter was alluding to in the introduction tonight, one of the things that you did do was clearly, because you'd come from the public service, you understood the public service and understood the differences of the roles. Just explore that for me.
Look, I hated politicians and ministerial staffers calling public servants bureaucrats, because I thought that was pejorative. Because having come up through the public service stream, I thought I had a good idea of what the different roles were all about. And yes, I had sort of jump roles, and over time as Chief of Staff my role became increasingly political, there's no doubt about that, but I could tell the difference. And I thought it was important that ministers and ministerial staffers know what the difference is, and it was important to the quality of advice that those differences were maintained. There were complementarities, each had a different role, and I thought it was important, for the sake of getting the right sort of advice, that you maintain. The worst thing was to have different groups all trying to second guess each other. Don't do someone else's job, do your job. And then out of this, ministers will craft a decision, a strategy, and find their way forward. Howard was, I thought, very good at that. I think he genuinely understood the differences of the different types of roles.
What was the key to his government's long-term survival?
Good question. I think, in terms of his own characteristics, a lot of the time he acted as if his back was to the wall. He didn't take anything for granted. He didn't think, oh, well, this is easy, we've got Beazley and this is no problem, whatever. A lot of the time he took the view that we could be knocked off any time, because he knew that while he might have an agenda and a strategy to put forward, as Kevin Rudd has found out lately, the X factor, things come out of nowhere that can blow you off course. And so he always knew you always got to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. So he was always prepared for something bad to really happen and batten down the hatches and how do we deal with this. So I thought that was a really good attitude that he had. He never became complacent. Now, we can talk about the end and what may have happened at the end, but I thought for a lot of the time he took that attitude, and it was a very good attitude of mine to have.
One of the things that's been said this year related to Peter Costello's exit from Parliament, and it was a commentary in the newspaper, and spoke about backbenchers going to Costello and saying, I need money for a school hall, or some such thing. And Costello saying, no, there's the budget deficit, the budget surplus needs to be maintained. That same person would go to John Howard, and he'd say, well, I can't do it now. But that Arthur had a means a few months later of coming up with the goods.
The relationship between Costello and Howard was very interesting. There was a real yin and a yang to it. I thought Peter really enjoyed his role as Treasurer, maybe enjoyed his role as Treasurer too much, because I'd have the odd backbencher or minister come to me and say, you know, when we go and talk to Peter about this, we have the feeling it gives you some advice and then sends you on their way. When we go and talk to Howard about it, we feel like he's in the trench with me or with us, and we'll work our way through this together. Different sort of attitude. So there were ways of saying no, and then maybe down the track find ways of doing things, but always people feeling like they got to say, they got to say their piece to the Prime Minister, and even if he couldn't accommodate them straight away, he'd registered the point and he might come back to it later or find some way of doing it. So it wasn't whether I found a way through or whatever, it was really the way he treated them. And I think probably at some stage Peter needed to have made that transition and convinced a number of his colleagues that he could operate in the same way.
I think you were part of an ANZOG discussion not very long ago about chiefs of staff from Prime Ministers going way back got together. A unique event in Canberra to discuss...
Don't tell me you got the transcript for that.
No, I don't have that. But discuss what the role was and what the tough parts were. As you reflect on that 9 years, what's the hardest part of the job?
The hardest part? The hardest part of the job was probably dealing with the expectations of backbenchers or ministerial staff who thought, well, you know, we're the government, we can do almost anything. Well, no, we can't really, and there are rules around how things are done. Not that too many people came to you asking for the law to be broken, but you always had to find a way of keeping people on board when you couldn't really do what they wanted. And sometimes you had to sack people, and that could be hard as well, particularly if they were people who had close links into the party. But the Prime Minister's view on all of that was always, well, I've been prepared to sack ministers, you people have got to be prepared to sack staff who aren't up to the job or aren't doing what's required. So that could be a bit difficult. But a lot of the time, I enjoyed the job sufficiently that I didn't really see it in terms of things being hard. There were issues that were challenging and we had to work our way through, but I never felt anything was too hard in that sense.
You get to meet everyone in that role. You got to meet the Pope, Yasser Arafat, the list goes on. Who struck you on the international stage as most impressive? It's
a good question. Well, when we met the Pope in, I think it was 2002, by that stage he was quite, maybe it was 2003, I can't remember now. He was quite frail, but he was still a very impressive figure, and I remember Howard in particular was very impressed by him because, you know, he was one of the seminal figures, particularly of the late 20th century, in terms of the Berlin Wall coming down and the role he'd played in Poland and etc., etc. Just to meet a figure like that, who'd had that sort of history-changing impact, was a privilege. Yasser Arafat, to meet someone who you'd seen on TV running around with, you know, the headdress and everything else, and then we met him in 2000. At that stage, he was quite optimistic that he could make peace with the Israelis. And I remember we were in Ramallah and he'd be gesturing out the window towards the water and there was gas out there and he was saying that gas is going to power the Palestinian state and we're going to lift living standards, and he was quite optimistic. And then of course it all turned to custard. He was an interesting figure. Colin Powell was an impressive figure. He was someone that stuck in people's minds because he was very good at putting people at their ease. I remember he put John Howard at his ease by starting the conversation every time they met, asking him about his son Richard, who was working in America at that stage. And that anything to do with the family, John Howard always reacted to very quickly. Colin Powell was very good like that. The two presidents I'd come across, Clinton, probably the best listener you'd ever come across. There might be a dining room table like the one next door and people around the table. And when he's talking, he's looking directly at people, engaging them. You feel as if he's talking to you individually. You're the only person he's talking to at that moment. Tremendous capacity to engage. Look across the table, sort of cup his chin in his hands and look at you, and off he went. Bush, very different sort of character. It was funny, I remember we went into a room at the White House called the Yellow Room just before dinner, and it's the first time I'd sort of formally met him, and he was wearing Texas boots. I thought to myself, this is like something out of a caricature. And then we went out onto a small veranda, and it was quite cold. I think it was February, before dinner. And he turned around, and I was in a small group, and he said, he said, I'm going to give more money to the President of Colombia if he kills those gorillas. I said, yeah, well, that sounds good. And he was smoking a cigar. Not that he was a caricature, but in many ways he came across as very self-assured, as someone who, once he'd made a decision, boom, that was it, off and running. And in many ways that's how it proved to be. Dick Cheney, very different figure, in many ways quiet, but when he decided to speak, he could really still the room. People just went quiet. Tremendous mind. And I could see how he could rally the Republican heartland, because he was seen as the conscience, if you like, of the administration in many ways, which was, he was very incredible, the amount of influence he seemed to have. Rumsfeld was an interesting character. He, the first time we met him, he took the PM aside to show him a list. This was a list of, I think, countries that were going to participate in the coalition of the willing, potentially. Then he came back out, didn't ask anybody's name, but while the discussion was going on, he had a list, and he'd be looking down the list to see who might be speaking. And then I remembered, of course, he'd gotten his schooling in the Nixon administration, where, you never give anything away unless you absolutely have to. And it was funny how these things stick in your mind, and then you look back later at how people behaved, and it becomes a microcosm of perhaps how they did things in a broader way.
We could go on all evening talking about that. 2006-07, why did the wheels come off? You left, of course. Some people said that was a sign that the wheels were coming off. No,
I don't think that was a sign of the wheels coming off. I mean, I left because been there, done that since, particularly that last stint since 95. So I'd been there a long time, and, one too many Christmas parties, making the same speech at the Christmas parties by the end. I had a son who was about to do the next stage of school, so if we were going to make a decision, it was the end of 06. Plus, that would be sufficient time for others to, undertake roles in the office, and we have an election about a year out. So the timing was right. It was about the time Rudd came on the scene.
Dion's about 5 at this stage, isn't he?
Yeah, about that, yeah. And what happened then, I think, is a bit of a parallel with 1995. When Howard came back into the leadership in 95, you could almost see the polls flip, and a 6 or 7 point gap opened up between the coalition and Labor through 95. Never really shifted. There was the odd blip. And then when Rudd came into the leadership in late 06, the same happened again. It was quite eerie, and you can almost track it, point for point, pardon me. So I think what was happening by then was, while ever Kim was there in his second incarnation, they weren't listening to Kim. They seemed to have given up on him. And at some stage, he just thoroughly lost his confidence. I remember when he made that that comment confusing Karl Rove with Rove McManus. That was really, his mind was really on edge, and people were paring away at him. Gillard and Rudd and the others were, preparing the groundwork to do him in. But he knew that he didn't seem to be cutting through with the public, even though some of the issues might be starting to go his way. And so once Rudd came along, it was almost like the people had permission to then shift. They felt, oh, well, this is fresh, this is new. This person, we've had some exposure to him through Sunrise and other things, and sounds articulate, speaks well. I mean, he's been blessed with a good voice, a bit like Bob Carr, a voice that sounds authoritative. And that is quite useful in politics. It's a sort of voice that people feel they can trust. And so by then, of course, 11 years in power, you accumulate a lot of baggage. There are things you've left undone. There are interest groups you've offended. I can remember the cost of living issue was a great example of this. I can remember some of the comments some of the ministers were making in response to Labor raising the whole cost of living issue. And they were attacking Labor over the cost of living issue. But the thing they weren't doing was expressing empathy for families who might have cost of living issues. I think what happens with governments beyond a certain time is that you do develop a bit of a tin ear to what's happening out there. You become so used to being able to shift the levers around, you think, at any time we can pull a rabbit out of the hat and it'll be okay. The coalition that got us into power will still be there. We'll bring them all back home. We'll run the same old scare campaigns. The same will happen to Labor. It always does. After a while, you start to believe that you can always fix it. It'll all be right on the night. And Australians do tend to give governments the benefit of the doubt. They do tend to favour incumbents. It does take a lot to get governments out, but by then I think it was time.
Let's talk about the not-for-profit sector for a few minutes,
Yep.
and then we'll bring this to a close. Your involvement with the Greek Orthodox Church in Canberra, you became really part of the community. So what was your reflection on the sort of issues that are the drivers there, and in particular from the government perspective?
Sure. Well, the smaller the organisation, the bigger the conflicts. It was funny because a lot of time was actually taken up with conflicts, not so much internal conflict, but a lot of the churches, the Greek churches, have been set up under a constitution where their committee was voted for by members of the church community. And then over time, archbishops of the day decided they wanted these churches to all be part of an archdiocese property trust with committees selected by the archbishop. And this tension really came to a boil in Canberra in the early 80s when there were fights over, for example, whether a new church would be built in Queanbeyan. And the Greek government was involved because there are a lot of Slav Macedonians in Queanbeyan. So there was this issue around, they've got a church there, the Greeks have got to fly the flag in Queanbeyan. The Greek government was saying, we'll support if there's a Greek church put into Queanbeyan. And then the fight with the Archbishop came over, well, is this going to be a community church, or is it going to be a church where the committee is appointed by the Archbishop and the church is part of the property trust? So you had all-out war and all sorts of compromise, and I was the treasurer of the Greek community in Canberra at that stage, and so I was in the thick of all this, and I thought, well, who needs real politics when you've got this stuff going on? That was my reaction, and over time, peace was there were moves towards peace and all the rest of it, and the community got on with things, and then the more productive part in terms of my contribution there came in the early 90s when we were able to persuade a lady in Canberra, a Greek lady who'd been very successful in business, to finance the building of the St Nicholas Home for the Aged. And she put in $1 million to get the thing built. So it started with no debt, and then we got federal government assistance in terms of the subsidies and whatever that you get for having aged care residents, and it started as an independent living facility and over time became more of a high care facility so people could transition through. I was involved in the building and commissioning of that, and also the St Nicholas Childcare and Preschool Centre.
So you're sympathetic, given those practical things you've been involved in, sympathetic to the idea of extending the role of the non-profit sector in doing services that governments formerly have done?
Very, very much so. And I've had some experience of that in government, and Peter will remember this well, in terms of the job network, when we made a move in 96, 97 to privatise a lot of job placement. And that wasn't of itself a cost-cutting exercise. We had the Commonwealth Employment Service, but there was a real view, and Howard very much shared this view, that if you can have providers in the community who feel a real affiliation or identification with the people they're trying to help, surely you'll get a better outcome than if it seems to be done at arm's length by, dare I say it, a bureaucracy run out of Canberra. So a lot of it was around, can we really get a more caring, a more effective outcome if we engage the people out there who are already trying to do all of this and try and give them a bigger share of the government dollar.
Just a final question then. When you get people that have been very influential, I think, in Indigenous policy, like Noel Pearson, Sue Gordon, and organisations like Mission Australia, Salvation Army, all of those people seem to have had a big impact on the Howard government, all of those organisations. Do you see a measurable increase or advance in the way the non-profit sector is being taken?
I think the very fact that we've now got a Centre for Social Impact and that we're focusing on the third way, as it were, in terms of service provision, I think is in partly a tribute of the work that was done over that period, not so much to the credit necessarily of the government, but there are a lot of actors, and some of them are in this room, who are very influential in getting the government to go down that route. And I'm sort of thankful in a way that the current government sees the value of that, and in some ways has tried to take it further through their formal adoption of things like the Board of Social Inclusion and some of the policies that go with that. I think there's a further way to go on all this, and I particularly think in Indigenous communities we need to go further in terms of encouraging some of these new structures that seem to be building up, particularly in more remote areas. If you read the sort of stuff that Nicholas Rothwell is talking about, leaving aside whether you declare the middle of the Northern Territory a homeland, this whole issue of, he's talking about new structures that are coming up, and Indigenous communities taking more responsibility for what they want to do. And I know that's one of the guests you've had on this program before, Ken Henry, who talked about in the policy formulation process making sure Indigenous groups have skin in the game. Well, part of that is recognising and rewarding when they're taking initiatives to build their own new structures. Because some of the old structures are rotten, they're corrupt, and they've managed to channel funds that should have been used at the grassroots. And anybody who looks back at the last 30 years and said they had the only one true way through this problem is telling you a big fib. We've got to be a bit more humble than that, but we've got to listen to Indigenous people a lot more and give them the assistance and let them take the lead.
Arthur, we have a much better picture of here you are and where you've come from, thanks to your generosity in the last half hour or so. So thank you very much.
Thank you.